And because the Synod represented mainline Reformed doctrine, they are often given the name Calvinists, after perhaps the most influential of the early Reformers, John Calvin, who actually lived the century before the Synod of Dort. Now, many of you are familiar with the acrostic TULIP. How many of you have ever heard the TULIP? T-U-L-I-P, okay? Now, it's used to refer to what are sometimes called the 5 points of Calvinism, which are really originally responses of the Synod of Dort to the 5 errors taught by Arminius, okay? TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, stands for the doctrines of total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible, or what I like to call particular redemption, but it doesn't spell tulip when you use that, so that doesn't work really, but irresistible grace, or effectual calling, and the perseverance of the saints. Well, it's this letter L that we want to consider this evening. What is meant by this idea of limited atonement? It addresses this question, for whom did Christ die? It's the question of the extent of the atonement. There are basically 2 ways in which Christ's death has been interpreted among, we could say, conservative Bible-believing Christians, both in the past and in our own day. One is what is referred to as the general atonement view. Okay? And there are those who hold to this view, who believe that Christ's death did not actually effectually atone for all the sins of any member of the human race. In other words, it did not infallibly secure the salvation of any sinner, but it made salvation possible for any sinner, dependent upon what that sinner decides to do with Christ's death. It made salvation possible for everyone, though it did not make it certain for anyone. In other words, according to this view, the effectiveness of Christ's death in saving sinners is not determined by the power and will of God in connection with the atonement itself. Its effectiveness is ultimately determined by the will of man. The will of man makes it effective. Or, of course, on the other hand, the will of man can render it ineffective, and in fact does make it ineffective for many people for whom Christ died. And this is commonly preached today. The view of the atonement is commonly preached today in evangelical circles, though some of those logical implications I just mentioned are often not really grasped and seen, is the doctrine of general atonement. But then there's a second historical view of the atonement, sometimes referred to as the Calvinistic or the Reformed view. Now, together with the other view, it denies the heresy of universalism. It denies that all men will ultimately be saved by the death of Christ. Yet it affirms that Christ's death did effectually atone for the sins of and infallibly secure the salvation of all those for whom it was intended. It did not do that for everyone, but it effectually atoned for all the sins of a specific, definite, particular category of persons. In other words, the death of Christ savingly atoned for all of the sins and infallibly secured the salvation of the elect, those whom God had chosen to redeem before the foundation of the world. It was a definite atonement, a particular atonement. And again, this doctrine has sometimes been called the doctrine of limited atonement. But I don't like that terminology because it's very, very misleading. Because both views limit the atonement, but in different ways. Okay, think with me. How is that? Well, you see, according to the doctrine of general atonement, the atonement is unlimited in its purpose. It is made equally and in the same way for every individual who has ever or will ever live. So it is unlimited in its purpose, but it is limited in its power, for it makes absolutely certain the salvation of no one. While according to the doctrine of a particular atonement, the atonement is limited in its purpose. It's specifically made with the purpose of saving God's elect, but it is unlimited in its power, for it makes absolutely certain that all those for whom it was made will be saved. So the terminology limited atonement is not really the best terminology to use for the Reformed view. I guess it was really chosen so you could have the need